"Keep up," mutters Wiggins. "The sooner we conclude our business here, the better." With hastened steps we follow the flickering trail of lanterns deeper into the cemetery. The dancing lights lead us through a narrow corridor of stone tombs flooding with the night's fog. When we emerge from behind the last mausoleum covered in brittle dead vines, a tall, lanky silhouette lunges towards us. "Watch your step, Mr. Holmes." Inspector Gregory points to the excavated grave directly between us, then raises a brow in surprise. "Sorry, gents. I was expecting Mr. Holmes. Is he coming along?" Mr. Wiggins shakes his head as he takes a knee beside the grave pit. "Afraid not, Inspector. Actually, Holmes was a bit irritated you sent for him. He doesn't look well upon grave-robbing wretches." "Rightly so, gents. But in this instance I thought Holmes might reconsider, as the man before you is one Theodore Watts." Wiggins narrows his eyes. "Should we recognize the name?" "I think not. But you see, Mr. Wiggins, the coffin Mr. Watts is resting on is his own. Theodore Watts, dead and buried not 3 days past, November the 10th. I'd expect him to be in it, not on it." "That is interesting, Inspector. Well, we'd be happy to look into this on account of Mr. Holmes."
The inspector nods. "Of course. Your assistance is most welcome, gentlemen."
"Any information on this Theodore Watts, Inspector?"
"Apparently a partner in a speculation company, Strand Financial." Our meeting is interrupted by the drawn and tired voice of a constable. "We sent the old man to his quarters, sir. We'll get no information from him tonight." Gregory waves his man off, then turns to us. "The cemetery caretaker, Jacob Edwards. He was the one who found Mr. Watts. Said he heard an awful scream, and when he came to investigate with his dogs, saw a shadow rushing off through the trees. Claimed it was the devil himself, he did."
"The devil gets the blame for the men who do his work," Wiggins replies, dropping down into the pit with utmost care. "This chap's had a bad go of it."
Gently inspecting the corpse's head, Wiggins continues.
"The neck seems intact, but the bruising is recent and severe. No gunshot or stab wounds. His clothes are muddy, looks like he was digging for a while. Dried saliva around the lips. I'd say the cause of death, tracheal rupture, leading to asphyxiation. How did you identify the body?"
"Yes, pure luck one of the constables happened to know him in person, and we already confirmed identity with the family. Imagine my surprise. I sent for Mr. Holmes immediately."
Turning his attention to the corpse, Wiggins gathers a handful of papers scattered around the coffin. "Papers of the court, prisoner notifications and requests. Too old and damaged, but the name Kevin Brooke appears on many of them. The last one here is an article from the Times nearly 20 years past. An announcement of commendation for excellence in prison reform, dedicated to one Ebenezer Sallow."
Wiggins pulls the papers close, examining a small piece of torn parchment, a list of 4 names attached to the back side. Finally, Wiggins passes the material to the inspector. Gregory shakes his head while reading the list of names. "None of these people come to mind. Oh, wait. Ebenezer Sallow again, and is crossed out. This can't be coincidence."
"And the coffin itself was empty?"
"Yes, Mr. Watts, the man who was buried 3 days ago, was laying just beside me here when we arrived. The decaying body bore an unbearable stench, and I saw no reason it couldn't be moved. We sent it back to Dr. Thomas Blood at Bart's Hospital if you'd like to examine it."
In reaching up to make his way out of the graves, Mr. Wiggins inadvertently grabs hold of a shovel lying next to the grave. The handle slips free, sending Wiggins stumbling against the pit wall.
"The tool Mr. Watts used to exhume the coffin." The inspector reaches for Mr. Wiggins.
"Most likely, but broken in 2. How odd."
The inspector's voice strains as he pulls Wiggins to the surface. "The murder weapon, perhaps?"
"Most certainly not. The neck was crushed from compression, strangulation without a doubt. Our murderer is one jumbo bloke, over 6 foot and 200 pounds.
Wiggins brushes the dirt free from his clothes.
"Was there nothing else when you first arrived, Inspector?"
Gregory produces a small red and gold brooch from his pocket. "Only this. Intertwined letters H and C, the Hellfire Club monogram. That bunch is never a stone's throw away from scandal."
Wiggins examines the brooch in silence for a moment. "Most peculiar." Then he looks back to the inspector with a furrowed brow. "I thought this Hellfire Club a mere group of bohemians."
"Hardly. We have quite the file on them back at Scotland Yard."
Wiggins packs his pipe with tobacco. "A violent encounter where our Mr. Watts, in his desperate final moments, tears away his assailant's membership pin. It's a theory. Now we have to see if the facts fit."
"Would you gentlemen like to examine Bunhill Field's burial ground further?" Mr. Wiggins lights his pipe.
"Not in this fog. We'll come back after it's lifted." We are greeted at the front desk by an Officer Hastings as soon as we enter the yard.
Ah, the gentleman working for Mr. Holmes. Inspector Gregory mentioned you'd be coming by.
The officer produces a thick envelope wrapped in frayed cordage.
Our file on the Hellfire Club.
Wiggins leans back on his heels, accepting the material with wide-open eyes.
Perhaps you can paraphrase?
Oh, most certainly. Though in truth, clarity and the Hellfire Club rarely go hand in hand. Firstly, Hellfire Club is somewhat a catch-all moniker for a very many groups. The monks of Mendham Alley, the Order of Knights of St. Francis, the Beggars' Benison. The full list of permutations is beyond memorization. Secondly, the Hellfire Club is not limited to London proper. There is a long history in Ireland, as well as more recent developments in France, Italy, and elsewhere throughout Europe. Lastly, and perhaps most significant, the groups do not keep formal records of its members.
Wiggins scratches his chin.
And what is these Hellfire Clubs do that warrant such a thick file?
Hastings throws up his hands in discontent.
They claim to be benevolent revellers, poking fun at societal conventions and living life by their own merit. But I tell you, they're a bunch of bad hats all the way round. Rumours around the club keep files on London's dirtiest secrets. We've been trying to bring them before the court on a charge of blackmail for some time now.
Wiggins flips through the file's contents.
Have you made any arrests at all of its members?
This is the task before us, gentlemen. What members? Only suspected members, mind you. Every time we try to put together a proper case that will stand before a judge, they slip through our grasp. There's only one bloke officially associated with the Hellfire Club in London, Samuel Ashmore. While we've yet to set a case against him, I tell you this, it is only a matter of time before we tie that wicked fellow to an indiscretion worthy of the noose.
Mr. Wiggins has a nervous air about him as we cross Baker Street, headed to the door of 221B.
Mr. Holmes pays us good money for gathering information for him. Maybe we should continue on our own before bothering him.
Before we can decide the matter, the door opens before us, revealing an upbeat Dr. Watson.
Ah, gentlemen, I was just heading out to see a patient. Mr. Holmes is in the parlour.
We tip our hats to John and shortly find Mr. Holmes sitting cross-legged in the middle of the parlour floor. Burning incense of the Orient, protruding from small brass bowls, surround him. The room is awash with rare odours. "Have you concluded the case of Mr. Watts already, gentlemen?" Holmes asks without opening his eyes.
"Concluded?"
Mr. Wiggins barks, pulling nervously on the collar of his shirt.
"Sir, we haven't but started."
Holmes opens his eyes and waves his hand before him, swirling the thin streams of smoke about him. "Meditation, my good men. It does wonders for the mind. I highly recommend it." With a sudden burst of movement, Holmes leaps up and moves across the parlour to a bookshelf, examining the contents with one hand to his chin. Blood-tinged bowels, headache, kidney failure, death, the bitter apple, Citrullus colocynthus.
"What's that now? Mr. Watts was strangled, Mr. Holmes, not poisoned."
Holmes looks to us completely vexed, then in an instant his face flushes with recognition.
"Mr. Watts, of course, yes. One of Gregory's men stopped by and gave me the particulars. Seems straightforward enough, gentlemen. Visit all the people that come before you, pay attention to the details, and deduce if they were a part of the crime. Don't forget locations can sometimes reveal more about a person or event than people themselves, so take note of any locations of relevance. Most certainly the 4 names on Mr. Watts's list, Ebenezer Sallow, Janet Wright, Richard Clark, and Fred Hughes, have some bearing on the case." Before we get a word in further, Holmes drops into a chair with one of the books from the shelves, spouting more Latin. Wiggins turns and heads towards the front door.
"We might as well have at it. We'll not get anything else from him when he's focused like this."
"Oh, Mr. Wiggins," Holmes calls out, "do send word as the case progresses. I'll keep an eye on your progress, and we'll arrange a meeting at its conclusion."
Our apologies to disturb you at this hour, Mrs. Watts, but if we are to catch Mr. Watts's killer, we must ask you a few questions.
Mrs. Watts looks at us from behind swollen, red, grief-stricken eyes.
Of course, of course. Inspector Gregory mentioned you gentlemen might be along.
We convene in the study, which sits darkened save a handful of tall burning tallows.
I'll try to make this as brief as possible, Mrs. Watts. When exactly did Mr. Watts first go missing?
A long, unsteady sigh precedes the answer.
7 days prior. I knew he had financial problems, but he always talked about it as something that he was going to fix soon. His disappearance was swift, unexpected. I was sure he will come back to me, Mr. Wiggins. Yes, it was the evening of November 6th.
And then they found a body.
Staring through the nearby window, Mrs. Watts replies with a distant, removed look.
At that time I believed my husband dead by such a dreadful manner. What could possibly be more embarrassing than suicide by gunshot to the face? We were already ruined. The funeral was private, family only, but some creditors somehow got the news and attended, to be sure.
As Wiggins is about to press the next question, a young woman enters carrying a tray of tea and biscuits. As she starts pouring, Mrs. Watts speaks coldly.
My chambermaid, Miss Lavinia White, gentlemen. Go on and leave it, Lavinia. We have matters to discuss, and the men can help themselves.
With a curtsy, the young woman smiles and moves to leave the room as Wiggins continues.
What about visitors or strange contacts?
The chambermaid stops and looks back with wide eyes at the question.
Other than the robbery, nothing.
The chambermaid's mouth opens and she raises a hand just as Mrs. Watts turns and catches sight of her lingering.
Lavinia, please, a little privacy.
The chambermaid turns and dashes out of the room. Wiggins scribbles in his journal, circling a word with dramatic emphasis.
What robbery do you speak of?
Taking a sip of tea, she leans back in her chair and throws her head to the side.
Well, it wasn't technically a robbery, as nothing was stolen. It was just yesterday. I'm not surprised you weren't told. I returned home from a visit with my aunt and found the front door ajar. I thought nothing of it, that Lavinia had simply forgot to lock the door on her way to the market, but when I entered I saw the entire place in shambles, as if a hurricane had torn through the entire house.
Mr. Wiggins' brows rise high on his forehead.
As if someone was searching for something, yes?
I couldn't say the motivations of the man. I can only recount what happened, Mr. Wiggins. That is to say, as I looked around in total shock, I suddenly felt the presence of something behind me. It felt very much like I had backed up against the wall itself, yet I had made no such movement. The next thing I knew, a tremendous painful pressure fell upon my neck, 2 hands choking the very life from me. I gasped and froze as a rough, strange voice whispered in my ear, "Your husband is not fooling us. We'll find them. We'll get the documents. You can be sure of it." I'll never forget those words as long as I live.
The teacup drops from Mrs. Watts's trembling hand. Taking her hand in his own, Wiggins tries to calm her.
Sorry, dear, that must have been an awful shock for you. Did you get a look at the chap?
After he spoke the words, he flung me across the room, straight into a bookshelf. It was Lavinia who roused me some time later after returning from the market.
On the way out, we look at each other. Wiggins's eyes narrow deep in thought.
That chambermaid, Lavinia White. I believe it would be in our interest to have a direct visit with her at a later time.
Our knock on the door calls forth a woman far removed from the chambermaid attire of Watts's residence, a young, dishevelled girl, more akin to a factory worker than the loyal servant of a gentleman's household. Her throat bulges beneath widening eyes as she struggles to swallow at seeing us once again. Mr. Wiggins swiftly takes the initiative.
Miss White, I couldn't help but notice you watching us from afar earlier today. Your manner gave the distinct impression you had something more to say. May we come in?
Retreating into the hall beyond the door, Miss White sways her arm behind us, beckoning us to enter.
Of course, Constable.
Wiggins corrects the young lady of our affiliations, then takes a stool beside her in the kitchen. Rain drips from the ceiling, and enough draughts blow through the house to sail a ship across the channel a dozen times over. The girl sinks into herself, looking at us from the corner of her eyes.
I don't mean to get the Watts in trouble. They're fine people, decent people.
Wiggins drops his hat onto the table.
Of course. We're not here to defame the deceased, Miss White. Our intention is only justice for Mr. Theodore Watts. Now, tell us, was there an error in Mrs. Watts's account of events?" Her young frame springs forward, exploding like a spring coiled one too many times.
"No, of course not. Mrs. Watts tells it straight."
Her eyes slide away from us. "Oh, for God's sake, girl, tell us!"
"It's like this,"
she says softly.
"November the 6th, the day before Mr. Theodore disappeared, a strange man came to the house."
With pen in hand, Wiggins asks with a single raised eyebrow, "His name?"
"Didn't give it, sir. Not that I heard, anyway."
She closes her eyes in concentration.
"He was a younger man than you, if you'll pardon the observation. Handsome, with dark brows, a thin moustache, and well-cut beard. He had a smile that charmed and spoke of something dreadful all at the same time."
Suddenly opening her eyes, she rushes to get up, but Wiggin bars her way with an outstretched hand, convincing her to remain seated. "Please, go on, Miss White. What did the man do during his visit?"
"He didn't hardly do anything. Mr. Theodore took him right into the study and they got to talking. Mr. Watts dismissed me right off, but the door to the study doesn't latch proper, and I couldn't help but linger."
"Did you hear what they discussed?" Wiggins asked, leaning closer to the nervous young woman.
"Bits and pieces, as best I can recollect. The stranger was very hot at Mr. Theodore. Something about using information on his own was strictly against club rules, as he put it. His face turned devilish something awful, talking about some papers. The stranger kept going on about how very hard they were to get, and Mr. Theodore's taking and using of them was inexcusable."
"And how did Mr. Watts take this? Was he angry?"
"Oh, no, sir. He spoke with an even softer voice. He apologized for his actions with sincerity. He pleaded about being ruined, losing his business, the house, jeopardizing Mrs. Watts's livelihood even, but the stranger didn't seem to care. He told Mr. Theodore to abandon any idea he had of continuing his scheme for individual gain, and to that end, as punishment for his treasonous crime, he had given Mr. Watts's identity to his target."
Wiggins looks straight to the girl's blue eyes. "Please, tell me the stranger mentioned Mr. Watts's target by name." Miss White shifts in her seat, placing her hands on her lap.
"They started speaking so soft. The only other thing I heard was the stranger telling Mr. Theodore he had come as a courtesy, and that maybe he could settle it shallow, or make time to pack up his wife and affairs and be off before the piper came to be paid."
Pushing her bangs away from her eyes, Miss White looks at us with furrowed brow.
"I couldn't make heads or tails of that last part, but that's what I heard."
Wiggins collects his things and we make our way to the front door. "You've been very helpful, Miss White. Thank you for your time." The chirping sounds of a piano playing Chopin greet us as we approach 39 Horseferry Road. Against the candlelight of a ground-floor window, the silhouette of a woman with her hair in a bun sits teaching a child the keys.
"Keep your fingers together and watch the bridge. Continue while I answer the door."
When she answers, Wiggins forgets his place and simply stares at the black-haired woman of his own age. After a moment, she smiles.
"Can I help you, gentlemen?"
Clearing his throat, Wiggins explains our intentions and the investigation at hand.
"I'm sorry, but I have no knowledge of this Mr. Watts or any of the associates you name, and I must be getting back to my student."
She tries to excuse herself, but Wiggins pulls off his hat and pleads, "We thought for sure you were connected to Mr. Kevin Brooke." The woman stops in her tracks, her face brightening.
"Of course I'm connected to him. I'm his daughter, Abigail Brooke."
"May I ask, where might he be found?" Before she can answer, Wiggins withdraws the news article and one of the prison requests. Abigail reaches for it, and Wiggins allows her to examine it. Within moments, her face draws tight and bitter.
"I'm sorry, gentlemen, but my father was convicted by this treasonous snake, Mr. Ebenezer Sallow. He died in prison shortly after his transport to Australia."
"Good heavens, I'm sorry to hear that."
Wiggins' sincerity is deep and genuine. "Well, you'd be the only ones. I remember my mother appealing to the courts for months, and not a single official would listen to her. My father was falsely accused and falsely sentenced. That Mr. Sallow was behind it all, the worst man England's ever seen."
Wiggins averts his eyes and speaks with clear discomfort. "Mr. Sallow is a respected and long-standing member of the Prison Commission, Miss Brooke. Perhaps the system itself was to blame, and not the unfortunate individual assigned to his case."
"You look like good, decent men, and I have nothing but respect for Mr. Sherlock Holmes. But if you've come for pleasantries about that man, you'll get none from me. He's a corrupt, vile man that stole and cheated his way into his position. My mother gathered documented proof he was bought and sold, sending innocent men like my father to the colony, all for pounds sterling and favour. I would wish him the executioner's blade, but such a fate is too merciful for a man that has poisoned the lives of so many."
She holds up her hand before Wiggins.
"I'll take my leave of you gentlemen now and return to my student."
Mr. Wiggins quickly snatches up her hand and kisses it gently. "We're very sorry to have upset you, Miss Brooke. I do hope you can forgive us." With a glow of anger, Miss Brooke closes the door and sends us on our way. Our wait in the parlour of Ebenezer Sallow stretches on for an eternity, though in fairness the quality of spirits and tobacco offered to us is of such fine quality one could hardly call it an inconvenience. Nearly an hour later we find ourselves directed to the library, where an older gentleman with grey hair and long whiskers, wrapped in a smoking jacket, sits reading the daily paper before a snapping fire. "I've been informed of your credentials, gentlemen. Now tell me, how can I be of service?" Ignoring the question, Wiggins steps toward the far wall, entranced by a map of Australia, nearly the size of the entire room. "I don't mean to be rude, but I was just sitting down to eat," Ebenezer continues. "Right, of course." Wiggins picks up a photograph of Ebenezer posing with some 30 guards before a prison gatehouse. "Are you a member of the constabulary, sir?" "Commissioner of Prisons, court-appointed discharger to the prison colony, retired. Of course, those were different times. Australia undergoes great change, and I suspect in a few more years they'll find themselves the way of the American colonies. Now, tell me, gentlemen, it's neither my profession nor history lessons that bring you here today, so, if you will." "We're investigating a very bizarre murder, Mr. Sallow." "Murder?" The thick white brows of our entertainer draw tightly together. "I still retain friends in high places, Mr. Wiggins. Tread carefully if you prepare to make any wild accusations." Mr. Wiggins fidgets with his cap, a bit taken by Mr. Sallow's underhanded threat. "No disrespect, sir. We simply inquire in hopes that you can shed some light on the affair. Does the name Theodore Watts carry any familiarity?" The old prison administrator squints, hardly giving the name consideration before barking, "Not at all. Who is he?" "The unfortunate victim of circumstances, I'm afraid. What about the Hellfire Club, Mr. Sallow? Have you ever had any dealings with them?" The lips of Mr. Sallow are drawn down in a trembling snarl of disgust. His face loses all colour. "Thieves and scoundrels. I told you mind your tongue while in my company. If your victim fancied himself a member of that group, he likely deserved everything he got." A side curtain to the chamber draws taut, announcing the arrival of a large, dark man with a leathered face and deep-set eyes, contrasted by a crisp white suit. "Ah, Mr. Peter Pete. Just in time. My appetite was beginning to turn." The man hobbles towards Sallow, favouring one side with a cane. In the other hand he carries a tray overflowing with such a bountiful course of oven-roasted fowl it would take 2 average servants to carry. Even walking partially hunched over with an aid, the exotic attendant towers over us. Sallow draws a napkin under his chin and waves us away. "I have nothing to do with those caliber of deplorable people, and nothing more to say to you. Good day, gentlemen." The warehouse of Dutton Shipping is abuzz with carriages dropping off various cargoes and crates. We have to inquire with no fewer than 4 people before we're directed to Mrs. Wright, who walks the floor with a register and pen in hand.
"Excuse me, Mrs. Wright. We're sorry to interrupt your affairs here, but it's a matter of great importance."
She scarcely looks up from her work.
"The apologies are all mine, gentlemen. I really don't have time for a proper meeting. I've got to have all these containers accounted for within the hour."
Mr. Wiggins removes his hat and speaks with haste.
"Then we won't keep you but a moment longer, and get right to the point. We're investigating the death of a man named Theodore Watts."
Without so much as a glance, she continues checking off her paperwork and sidestepping to the next crate.
"Don't know any Theodores, gentlemen, living or deceased."
Wiggins presses his lips together, deep in thought.
"Strand Financial, ma'am. Does your company do any business with them?"
Again, without looking up.
"Dutton does business with 3/4 of London, Mr. Wiggins, but the name Strand isn't any account I know of."
The frustration shows on Wiggins' face.
"I don't suppose you know any members of the Hellfire Club, either?"
At the mention of the name Hellfire, Mrs. Wright stops dead in her tracks. The pen nearly fumbles to the floor as she straightens up and looks to us directly. Her face flushes crimson.
"I'm a proper Christian, thank you. I'd burn in hell before I kept acquaintances like those. Good day, gentlemen."
Without waiting for our response, Mrs. Wright sets off across the warehouse.
"Out of the way! Coming through!"
A burly lad carrying a stack of wooden crates 4 feet high nearly knocks us over as he barrels through the office doorway of Strand Financial. At least a dozen people work busily behind him, packing everything in the office, from the papers in the desks to the desks themselves, each and every package splashed with a black ink stencil that reads Barclays Bank. The movers ignore us each in turn, save a few iterations of the same response. "Sorry, old chaps, I'm just here to move the assets for the sale. Everything's going on the block." Just as we decide to call Strand Financial a dead end, an attractive young red-haired girl approaches.
"Gentlemen, you look lost. Can I help you with something?"
Our introductions are brief. At the mention of Mr. Watts's untimely demise, the young girl swoons and nearly faints. Gently lowering herself to one of the only remaining cushioned chairs, she startles with eyes full of tears.
"Oh, how horrible! Poor Mr. Watts! What a fine man and a good partner all these years, until the very end. I must send my condolences to his wife, Catherine Watts, at once. She must be devastated. Seldom have I seen a couple so very much in love."
"You said until the end, miss. What happened as of late?"
"Bad business decisions. He and my uncle, Nicholas Price, owned the company you see. Uncle blamed him for everything that facilitated this." She motions around her. "But such is the nature of business, I suppose."
"Do you think your uncle may have taken out his frustrations on Mr. Watts?"
"Oh, heavens, no. Uncle Nicholas is an old man with a weak heart. I've never seen him lose his temper with anyone."
Wiggins steps aside, 2 men carrying a desk, and withdraws his pipe. Reaching for his pouch of tobacco, he continues,
"Do you know of anyone who may have wished harm to Mr. Watts?"
The young girl writhes in her seat, her eyes no longer streaming with tears, but wide open.
"Not Mr. Massey. Don't you dare say the name, Lucas Massey."
We look to each other with raised brows.
"Mr. Massey was Mr. Watts's personal assistant, nearly inseparable in the last few years, but the two had a bitter falling out a couple of months ago. In fact, now that I think of it, in one of their arguments, Lucas told Theodore his current course of action would be the company's undoing. But I wasn't privy to the full conversation. I only heard the shouted parts in passing, and sadly I can't tell you more."
Wiggins strikes a match and lights his pipe.
"You've actually told us quite a bit, miss, but one final question, if I may. Why do you vehemently stand by Mr. Massey?
Passion has a way of making people unpredictable, does it not?
Oh, no, sir, not with Mr. Massey. He's a good egg. I'd trust him with my own life.
Wiggins nods and thanks the young lady for her time before leaving the doors of Strand Financial to close for the last time. A plump chambermaid greets us, gives us a quick and somewhat cold once-over.
On account of the upcoming celebration, the masters of the house are not taking guests. Come back after the 23rd.
Without waiting for our reply, she motions us off, then shuts the door in our faces. Upon arrival at the bank, we are escorted to the reading room, where we are met by Fred Hughes, approximately 45 years of age, close-cropped salt-and-peppered hair, an air of confidence in his manner. Hughes puts down the ledger before him and stands with a pleasant formality.
"Good day, gentlemen. As I understand it, you're here in assistance to Scotland Yard. Anything I can do to help our fine gentleman in blue, consider me at your service."
Motioning to the chairs before him, we remove our coats and take a seat.
"Theodore Watts, Mr. Hughes. Does the name ring a bell?"
We are both shocked by Mr. Hughes' quick response.
"Watts? Of course, Theodore Watts and Nicholas Price, co-owners of Strand Financial. I don't know either of them personally, but their firm does moderate business in the banking district."
Excited, Wiggins presses on.
"Have you ever met Mr. Watts in person?"
Hughes' demeanor is relaxed and genuinely confused.
"As I just said, I don't know either of them personally. No, I've never met them, nor handled their accounts. If I recall with any accuracy, Barclays Bank held most of the notes. I'm sorry I can't be of more help, gentlemen."
Wiggins rises and shakes Mr. Hughes's hand.
"Thank you for your time."
As we take up our coats to leave, Wiggins turns and asks,
"On a personal matter, if I may, Mr. Hughes, if I wanted to pledge the Hellfire Club, who would I see about that?"
The confident energy vanishes from Mr. Hughes's face like the last rays of light vanishing at sunset. He leaps from his seat, snatches the ledger before him so fast he flips the book open, sending a dozen papers sprawling across the floor.
"You should know better, Mr. Wiggins, mentioning those villains in my presence, in my place of employment, no less. Of all the beef-headed indiscretions, scandal can get a gentleman fired. I have no information of such matters, and bid you not call on me again."
Mr. Hughes storms off, leaving a handful of bankers staring at us with gaping mouths. We arrive at Mr. Nicholas Price's house to falling brick debris and chunks of soot. After Wiggins gives a shout, a middle-aged chimney sweep, black as pitch, bobs his head over the edge of the roof.
"Sorry, Governor. You didn't get the word. The old chap's been admitted to the hospital."
Wiggins throws his hand up to his brow to get a better look at the informant.
"Which hospital, sir?"
"Couldn't help you there."
The sweep tips his hat and then disappears from view. We arrive at Barclays just before closing. The clerk ushers us out, telling us to return on the morrow, but just as we reach the door, an executive of a bank, overhearing the situation, intervenes.
"Did you say Sherlock Holmes? The Sherlock Holmes?"
Wiggins snorts towards the clerk.
"Indeed I did. We have just a few questions regarding an open case of the Yard.
In moments we find ourselves sitting in a private room drinking tea with Mr. Oliver. Strand Financial. Wiggins' tone is direct and inquisitive. Mr. Oliver doesn't even bother to withdraw a ledger. Instead, he sits back and drinks.
Tragic. Just tragic. It's events like this that make banking an all-around muddle at times.
We glance at each other, surprised at Mr. Oliver's blasé attitude. Wiggins looks back to the executive with a raised brow. That's a fine way to look at the murder of a man. Mr. Oliver lurches forward, spilling half his tea.
Murder? Good God, man, what are you going on about?
When Wiggins catches the executive up, he leans back in his chair, his face awash in worry.
Oh, this is most unfortunate. Everything will be much more complicated now. You see, gentlemen, Strand Financial held considerable notes from Barclays, many guaranteed outside of the company by Mr. Watts himself. We stopped the clock on Mr. Watts and the company over a month ago.
Wiggins sets down his tea. Are you saying that Mr. Watts owed Barclays money?
Yes, I thought I just made that abundantly clear. He owed the bank a considerable debt. Even after the liquidation of Strand Financial's assets at auction, the sum he'll be, or would have been, personally responsible for was more than many make in a lifetime. Though now that seems wholly irrelevant. I should have known something was afoot when we couldn't reach him these past few days.
A pale man with yellowed teeth and circles around his eyes greets us at the side entrance to the mortuary of Bart's hospital. We're looking for Dr. Thomas Blood. And found him you have. What can I do for you, gents? We have some questions about the body of Theodore Watts, or rather the first body of Theodore Watts. Right. Dr. Blood motions us to follow him into the mortuary and takes us presently to the body in question. 'Tis not right that a man can't find any peace in death, no matter the name on the tombstone, he says with a nervous twitching. Suicide. Gunshot to the side of the head. What is it you gents wants to know? Wiggins holds a handkerchief to his mouth and nose, looking down to a body missing the vast majority of its face. The obvious, dear man. How did you identify the body as Mr. Watts, despite the lack of
facial recognition. All kinds come through here, gents. Lots of men and women lost their way in the complexity of modern life. Mr. and Mrs. Doe, the lot of them, but this fella, this Mr. Watts, or so I believed, came as neatly packaged as I ever saw. See the gold ring there? Mr. Watts's personal signet ring. And the wallet in his coat pocket, ample papers all attached to Theodore Watts or that, Strand Financial Company of his. A quick glance through Watts's wallet, and Wiggins hurriedly returns the handkerchief to his nose. Typical affairs for a businessman of London proper. Did anyone confirm the body? Dr. Blood covers the corpse with a cotton, then proceeds to exit the mortuary. Of course. We always notify next of kin. I remember clearly the gentleman's wife, Catherine Watts, a pleasant woman, quite a bit of raspberry, came here on November 9th. And she confirmed Mr. Watts's identity without question. Dr. Blood cringes and nervously rubs the side of his face, smearing it with dirt. Well, as much as one could for a body as such. She instantly recognized the ring and personal items. I clearly remember when I revealed the body, she fainted in a most dramatic fashion. Didn't have the heart to put her through it again. Besides, she said the bloke hadn't come home for a few nights. Been missing since the 7th, I think she mentioned. Everything pointed to a proper identification. Wiggins returns his handkerchief and withdraws his journal.
So, if the real Mr. Watts died today, who does this body belong to?
Dr. Thomas Blood touches his brow. If I have to guess, gentlemen, some poor fellow whose body was acquired for a few pounds from one of London's morgues and used to fake Mr. Watts's death. Taking in the fresh air, we thank Dr. Blood and move on.
The paintings and sculptures that clutter the foyer of Ashmore's Manor speak to a family of considerable wealth. Ashmores want for nothing. The deep voice pulls our attention to the sweeping carpeted steps. We have been blessed with a sizable fortune, sprung forth from the bosom of the church itself. Samuel Ashmore glides down the steps with elegance and poise, one black silk-gloved hand grasping the rail, the other brandishing an ebony cane of high polish. His sharp moustache and triangular beard, groomed to the impeccable standards of high society vanity. His flowing auburn locks and strong jawlines, hallmarks of the naturally handsome. But something in his eyes, their darkness perhaps, or slightly deep-set nature, creates an impression of all-fired wickedness about him. Ironic, isn't it?
How's that, sir?
That the public face of the Hellfire Society would be built around the very thing we openly mock.
As you say, sir. If we may, I'd like to ask you a few questions about—
Ashmore turns and walks off towards an archway in the rear of the foyer, before Wiggins can finish. This way, gentlemen. I make it a policy never to speak to the police sober. The conversations are simply too much of a bore. He laughs, fully amused by his own cleverness.
We're not the police, sir.
A clanking of glass rings out as Ashmore haphazardly pours 3 old fashions with brandy. Inspectors of the yard, constables of the law, agents of the court, lackeys of the great Sherlock Holmes. No offence intended, gentlemen. He hands each of us a glass and raises his own above his head. Here's to cats of a different colour.
Indeed, and none taken, of course, Mr. Ashmore.
He places his glass of liquor on an end table.
Since you seem to know who we are without any introduction, I must also assume you know why we're here.
Slumping down in a high-back, Gothic-style garnet chair, Ashmore throws one leg over its arm and swirls the brandy in his glass. This Theodore Walsh fellow found himself on the wrong side of a murder. Well, gentlemen, I'm sorry to say I have no affiliation to the man. None whatsoever.
What's Theodore Watts?
As you say.
I don't suppose you'd be able to furnish us with a list of members to your group?
Ashmore belly laughs. Gentlemen, a secret society that divulges its membership shows no understanding of the word to which it subscribes. Ashmore rises from his seat and approaches. But I will tell you this. If you were to see a genuine list of our members, you would be shocked and amazed. Some of England's most notable families are among us. Wiggins nods.
I do not doubt it for a minute, sir.
Ashmore leans forward and places his hand on Wiggins's shoulder. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, my friends, but the truth is, the Hellfire community is really just a gathering of wealthy men and women bored with the conventions of dogma. There is not a ripper among us. Of this I assure you.
Wiggins looks around the study. Unlike the foyer, the art of the study has a macabre tone, paintings of devils and witches, a sculpture of a hanged man, more than one medieval bladed weapon. Ashmore finishes his drink in a fast gulp and narrows his eyes.
I see you are unconvinced. Then there is really only one means to exonerate our organization. Liverfish, gentlemen.
We both respond simultaneously. Liverfish?
Indeed.
Ashmore scribbles an address on a piece of parchment and hands it over to Wiggins.
The word is the password of entry. The address I give you here is our next meeting. A masquerade ball. Come in costume and enjoy the festivities, or come as you are to watch. Either way, you will see with your own eyes our true benevolent ways.
"999 Seymour Street is a private estate on the northern border of London proper, just east of Regent Park. Years of neglect shroud the property in weeds and vines. If not for the menacingly large servant at the door bearing the beaked mask of a plague doctor, one would assume the estate abandoned. "Liverfish!" Wiggins exclaims at our approach. The servant bows, unravels a chain about the door latch, and pushes it open, revealing a pitch-black hall. A muffled voice of tin speaks out.
"Through the veil of consciousness, gentlemen, a world of dreams await."
Summoning our courage, we enter into the darkness, arms reaching blindly before us, startling when the door slams and locks behind us. Only the faint sound of violins fortifies us to press on. Pushing through a series of heavy black velvet curtain, our eyes are finally assaulted by a concert of blazing chandeliers and scores of dancers in costumes. Within moments, a bare-chested man behind a fox mask presses intimately behind us.
Gentlemen, for a moment I thought you'd not show.
Well, it is our job to show. Samuel Ashmore, I presume? The grin just peeking out beneath the mask is unmistakable.
Ah, excellent. Then let us waste no time and reveal the true face of the Hellfire Society.
Leaping atop the base of a Greek statue depicting a naked woman in the most immodest pose, Ashmore throws his cane aloft and shouts until the music breaks and the dancing stops.
Bring out the Virgin's blood. It's time at last to pay our Lord respect. Camille Saint-Saëns! Camille Saint-Saëns!
The unseen musicians take up again, sweeping the screeching melody of Danse Macabre over every soul present. We watch as with shouts of glee a large jug of red liquid passes from one person to the next. Their sips are not dainty and measured, but wild and without care. Crimson pours from their lips, down their chests, across their costumes, pooling on the floor. A most animalistic scene if ever there was one. Ashmore himself takes a tremendous swig of the elixir before passing it to Wiggins, who only sniffs and mumbles, "Merlot, if I'm not mistaken."
Oh, where's your imagination, gentlemen? Now you see the primary prerequisite for membership. There is but one other.
We pause in eager anticipation. Ashmore in turn undresses, standing before us stark naked save his fox head mask. Nearly everyone present follows suit, and the dancing commences once again. Unimpressed, Wiggins cautiously makes his way around the participants and approaches a door by which a handful of caped men have entered since we arrived, but not one has exited. As he reaches for the doorknob, a cane smacks his hand. Mr. Ashmore pushes between us, bringing with him a woman under each arm, wearing nothing more than a few strands of black beads and colorful butterfly masks.
I would warn you, gentlemen, for your own safety. There are some doors that, once opened, can never be returned from.
Wiggins nods to Mr. Ashmore and the women. Indeed. Come on, we've seen enough. We leave the estate,
carried by the echoing laughter of Samuel Ashmore and sharp violin strings. We return to the cemetery after the fog has lifted and immediately make our way to the tree line east of Mr. Watts's grave. A recent rain has left the ground soft enough to maintain an impression, and in no time Wiggins calls out,
"Ah, just as the caretaker claimed. Footprints leading behind the trees and out of the cemetery."
Carefully crouching along the imprints, Wiggins points to each impression in turn, utilizing the end of a broken tree branch.
"See here? Every other impression is twice the depth of the other."
The murderer stepped heavily on his right side, as if carrying a heavy load upon that shoulder.
"Precisely," Wiggins exclaimed, standing up. "Now we only need query the caretaker and figure out what the culprit carried."
A voice calls out so near behind us that we startle at his words.
"Not a thing that I saw. The man carried nothing."
"Curious," is Wiggins' only reply. "Tell us, Mr. Edwards, were there any personal effects added to Mr. Watts's body before burial?"
The old man averts his eyes and mumbles.
"A man has died here, Mr. Edwards. Others may be in danger. You must tell us all that you know. No fault will be compounded upon your shoulders."
With a deep sigh, the caretaker looks back across the plots.
"Well, now that you mention it, I seem to remember a man of white shaggy hair and thick spectacles appearing long after the services. The end of it, I remember him saying."
"And the belongings, Mr. Edwards? Did he place anything in the coffin?"
The old man scoffs at the idea.
"I don't let anyone harass the dead in my cemetery, thank you. £5 he paid me to place a book with some loose papers about it, and some other trinkets. Perhaps I really can't recall, but it all fit within a small bundle of cloth."
Wiggins steps before the caretaker enough to maintain an impression, forcing his attention on him.
"A small brooch of red and gold, perhaps?"
"Perhaps. My memory is not what it was in younger days. All I remember truly is the book and the papers."
"Thank you, Mr. Edwards. You've been most helpful."
We're met at the door by a freshly shaven man of such youthful appearance he could pass for a student at London University.
"We're looking for a Mr. Lucas Massey."
"How can I help you?" he asks, struggling to finish a tie about his neck while holding the door with one foot. Wiggins squints.
"Mr. Massey of Strand Financial."
"As of late, Strand Financial." Mr. Massey turns and retreats into his home, raising his voice to compensate. "Currently unemployed, as it were. Preparing at this moment for a review at a new institution. Please come in while I finish. Now, who are you, and how can I be of service?" We deliver our introductions and reasons for the visit as Mr. Massey dances from one room to the next, putting himself straight. When we reach the murder of Theodore Watts, a bottle of aftershave shatters against the floor. "No, don't say such things, gentlemen. Please tell me there is a significant margin of error."
"I'm afraid not."
With a dazed look in his eye, Mr. Massey withdraws a bottle of whiskey and a glass from the cupboard. He mumbles while pouring.
"Oh, lad, what have you gone and done?"
Wiggins immediately perks up.
"Come again? You believe Mr. Watts somehow precipitated his own demise?"
Massey drops into a lounge chair. Getting the spike, he squeezes the glass to white knuckles.
"That damned Hellfire Club, without reserve, I assure you."
"I don't quite follow. Do you mean to say members of the Hellfire Club have been harassing Mr. Watts?"
No, you've got it all wrong. Watts was a member, you see, or at least so I gathered."
We move closer, waiting for the details Wiggins has provoked.
"As you surely know, I've been in Theo's employ these past years. He was quite a solid character until only recently. A few months ago he mentioned an invitation to attend a Hellfire Club party.
Ever since that night, he wouldn't shut up about them, not speaking in detail about their affairs, mind you, but the pleasure, excitement, and later on success that surrounded them.
Success?
The particulars escape me. I can only say Theo became completely unpredictable and reckless with his finances, with the company's finances. It was quite the sailing vessel at sea, one minute plunging to the depths of despair, quarrelling about every dollar, lamenting every bill, and then the next, riding the high crest, spending money without care.
Was that the nature of your falling out?
Indeed, gentlemen, I warned him. Whatever he was up to was a serious fopper, clouding his judgment, so much so he was putting himself, his wife Catherine, and the entire company at risk. He became so damned stubborn, angry, said he can use his connections to get money fast. Well, what good is a second if you ignore their advice in all matters? But for the love of me, I never thought it was as malignant as to lead to murder. How bloody awful!
Wiggins looks deep into Lucas's vibrant, innocent eyes as he continues. So there was bad blood between you, forcing you out of your employment?
Hardly, gentlemen. Theo was a friend. As impulsive and scattered as he became, an able man can always find another employer. In fact, I reached out to him just over a week ago, November the 3rd, if memory serves.
We looked to Mr. Massey in utter surprise, one of the last people to have seen the victim alive.
Our conversation was trivial. I only remember it because he acted so damn odd, sweating as if he'd ran from Lambeth to London Bridge, his attention completely preoccupied with meeting a new client at Blackwell Station later that afternoon. It was supposed to solve his financial problems somehow. I was glad to hear that. Strand needed money, and soon.
Mr. Wiggins takes a deep breath, churning the interview in his mind's eye. One last question, if you please, Mr. Massey. You mentioned an invite to the Hellfire Club. Do you know who put forth the invitation?
It's unknown to me, gentlemen. The only name I can give for the whole affair is Ashmore, for whatever it's worth, for I don't even know who it is, only that I overheard Theo speak the name a number of times in passing since his descent began.
It's unlikely to bear fruit, coming to the rail for clues days after the fact, but as Mr. Holmes always says, the detective's greatest tool is an imagination that leaves no stone unturned until all the facts that can be had are had. Blackwell proves as time-consuming and as uneventful as Wiggins predicted, until the last interview of the day, a young porter named Thomas. I couldn't tell you the day for certain, but it's just a few days back. November the 4th was by my best guess. There was a giant of a fellow, stood at the end of the station holding a large briefcase, stood there like a statue, hours on end. Can you describe him?
Long coat and hat, stood in the shadows, couldn't hardly get a good look at him, not that I wanted to or tried. I tend to avoid the giant types on account of my smaller stature, and that bloke was all over red. No thanks, I kept my distance the entire time he was standing there.
Wiggins lifts his hat and runs his fingers through his hair. Not much of a lead.
The lad throws up one hand. Hold on, you didn't let me get to the best part. A bit after break, I look back and the giant statue's finally gone, but his briefcase is still there. Now, people lose their luggage all the time on the rail, but I've never seen anyone leave their one sack they've been holding on to nearly all day long.
That is peculiar.
I'll say, and when I went over to collect the lost item, I nearly get ploughed over by another bloke sweating like a horse and all out of breath. Before I can get a word in, he grabs the bag and takes off. Didn't even notice the...
The young man suddenly stops and swallows hard. Wiggin raises a brow. Go on, lad. What did the gentleman not notice? Glowing, the porter looks around nervously.
It's not like I stole it, sir. I wouldn't have to give it back to the station, would I?
We both shake our heads no, goading the young man to continue.
£100 banknote, sir. Slipped straight out of the case.
Burn me if the case wasn't stuffed with them. I did try to call the man back, honestly, but he didn't slow down in the slightest."
While young Thomas didn't get a look at the giant who left the case, he did get a thorough glance at the second man who took the case, and describes Mr. Theodore Watts almost to the letter. The amphitheatre bustles with circus performers moving about the grounds, preparing for the night's show. It doesn't take long to find the gargantuan bearded Russian standing at the center of a crowd. Towering over the tallest man present by a good foot, Nanak proceeds to pulverize blocks of ice. The giant holds them single-handedly and simply squeezes them until they explode into 1,000 pieces. After the display of uncanny strength, we look at each other and nod. Clearly the Russian meets the physical characteristics of our murderer. Alas, our hopes are short-lived when we speak to Nanok's English interpreter and manager, a man with blazing red hair flowing beneath a tattered top hat and wearing a gold-tasseled vest 3 times too small. "Nanok can crush 3 men's necks with one hand with ease, but I am afraid, gentlemen, he has been training from noon until 9 p.m. every day this week." The alibi, confirmed by other performers, eliminates our Russian visitor as a possible suspect. We arrive at the Criterion Bar precisely at 4 p.m., just as previously instructed by Sherlock Holmes. London's affluent crowd the establishment, making it difficult to find our way to the back of the main room, where Holmes and Watson sit already enjoying a pint. "Ah, Mr. Wiggins, punctual as ever," exclaims Holmes. "Watson and I were just discussing the preliminaries to a new case that is so muddled and knotted it will surely demand each and every one of our keen perceptions to crack." Mr. Wiggins looks dumbfounded. "But, Mr. Holmes, we've not concluded our current case. Poor Mr. Watts deserves justice." A familiar voice barks out from behind. "Not concluded the case? And what the devil did you summon me here for, Holmes? I've got a jail cell overflowing and a backlog of court filings a mile high." Holmes strikes a match to his pipe and motions for Inspector Gregory to sit down. The intentions of my colleague's words were that he had not brought the conclusion to your attention, Inspector, which is precisely why you were summoned, as you will see in but a moment, to this precise spot and time. Holmes puffs on his pipe, turning to Mr. Wiggins. "If I may." Fumbling to sit down, Mr. Wiggins looks to the rest of us a bit perplexed. "But, Mr. Holmes, we haven't given you but a handful of the facts. How can you possibly—" An abrupt cough from Mr. Watson silences the confused neophyte detective. With a nod, he corrects his line. "Excuse me, Mr. Holmes. Please, go ahead." Holmes grins warmly. The case of Mr. Theodore Watts is more complex in appearance than actualities. As no sane man would take on the task of exhuming the body of a man accidentally buried in his place, the first body must have been buried with Mr. Watts's direct endorsement. And more to the point, his task at digging up the body would only come upon his need to retrieve something from the casket. If we discover Mr. Watts's motivation for his actions and the nature of the item he sought, the identity of the murderer will surely follow. To unravel the riddle before us, we need look no further than the daily papers to begin. Strand Financial, Mr. Watts's speculation company, liquidated. All assets seized. His partner, Mr. Nicholas Price, admitted to hospital for collapse of nerves, not unreasonable for a life of hard work lost on a single roll of the dice. "Roll of the dice, Mr. Holmes?" Wiggins asked with a raised brow. The particulars are of little importance, though I suspect, as both the paper and Mr. Price alludes to, a real estate deal regarding the expansion of the courts. A most risky, overpriced purchase of otherwise useless land, taking up on rumour and hope. The gamblings of a man overcome with debt, or more plainly put, a man of desperation. Where a desperate man alone is a danger to himself, a desperate man belonging to a group of the underworld is a danger to everyone around him. "The Hellfire Club!" exclaims Inspector Gregory. "The Hellfire Club, indeed," nods Mr. Holmes. "A band of educated, wealthy men, willing to do whatever is called for to maintain their position and lifestyle. I've had more than one run-in with members of the so-called Hellfire Club. While I attest most are ignorant to their participations, those among their commanding ranks are the very definition of deplorable." Wiggins leans on the table with both arms, looking to Holmes with intense, narrowed eyes. "Then the brooch from the assailant, Mr. Holmes. Surely someone from the Hellfire Club killed Mr. Watts." "Your first of only two blunders, Mr. Wiggins, for you deduced that the brooch was torn from murderer during a struggle, but there was no fabric caught in the clasp, nor was the clasp broken. To be pulled free from the clothing without signs of such is a far stretch indeed. As you may have learned from Lucas Massey, Watts himself had thrown in with Samuel Ashmore and his ilk. No, the brooch was not the assailant's, but Mr. Watts's own, without a doubt buried with the body, along with the book and papers, then dropped some time after the struggle of Mr. Watts's final moments." "But the papers found at the grave were decades old. A paper clipping and some old tattered prison documents. What possible relevance could they have had today? Surely they held no intrinsic value." Holmes puffs on his pipe and grins. "To you or I, no. But to the other parties involved, I would say the book and papers would be quite invaluable. Don't you see, gentlemen? The value has already been established. Mr. Watts's young chambermaid, Lavinia White, spoke of a strange visitor who was insulted by Mr. Watts's theft of the materials. The description of the stranger could not have painted a more vivid picture of Mr. Samuel Ashmore, a confidant of Mr. Watts already established by Mr. Massey. One hardly need make a leap of deduction. The public head of the Hellfire Club, a group suspected of keeping vast records of secrets against London's high society, arrives unannounced and chastises its member for taking the club's documents. fragments of said documents found at the scene of a murder which, through the use of the London Directory, leads to the only living relative of a man imprisoned, Miss Abigail Brooke, the daughter who still swears all these years later of her father's innocence, falsely sentenced by Ebenezer Sallow, a woman who, more than offering her testimony, vows to documented proof of Sallow's wrongdoing. Wiggins leans back in his seat. Blackmail. Holmes raises a single brow. Mr. Watts, an overextended, desperate man and member of the Hellfire Club, steals a collection of documents containing the secrets of a handful of men and women of wealth or position who have incriminated themselves in a manner to which they prefer to pay quiet sums under the table rather than bring their indiscretions to light. The inspector grimaces and waves his hand dismissively before him.
Theories, Mr. Holmes. I do hope you have not brought me all the way down here for idle conjecture.
Holmes pulls his pipe from his mouth and looks at the inspector. One can hardly gather evidence of a crime that is never reported, Inspector. Blackmail is often the shrewdest form of coercion. However, in this case our story is far from over. Remember, Mr. Massey spoke of his long-time friend and employer as nervously distracted by a later appointment at Blackwall Station. And, following up, we discover a man of extraordinary size, who waits patiently, then leaves a bag, presumably filled with banknotes, intercepted by another party. Lowering his head along his half-empty pint-glass so that his eye appears 5 times its normal size, Holmes continues with increased enthusiasm. And let us not forget, gentlemen, only one name of the 4 on Mr. Watts's list was crossed out, Ebenezer Sallow. As a thing crossed out infers it is no longer needed, we can deduce Mr. Watts was set out to blackmail his victim and was successful. With this assumption in place, we need only look for anyone in the victim's employ, loyal enough to make delivery of the demanded funds while fitting the description given by the porter. Luckily there are not many giants roaming London proper. "That aboriginal fellow, Peter Pete!" cries Wiggins.
"It's not adding up, Holmes," growls the inspector. "If Watts took a receipt of a considerable blackmail payment, why disappear?"
"Please keep up, Inspector. As I noted earlier, Lavinia White said that Mr. Ashmore gave up Watts to Mr. Sallow as punishment. Mr. Watts knew it was only a matter of time before Sallow lashed out. Not wanting any harm to befall his wife, his only option was to disappear." Reviewing his journal, Wiggins touches his pen to his tongue. "Mr. Watts's death would have made Mr. Sallow's revenge a moot point. But I don't understand. If everything had gone according to plan, why in the devil did he return to Bunhill burial grounds?" "Dates, my good man. The devil is in the details. Watts was buried on November 10th. On the 12th, his wife encountered Mr. Pete in her home." Wiggins nods. "Mr. Sallow didn't fall for Watts's ruse or didn't care. It was intent to recover the documents at any cost." "A cost Mr. Watts was unwilling to pay. Perhaps he intended to bargain further, using them again as leverage, or offer them up to Mr. Sallow to make amends, or turn them over to you, Inspector. At this point we will never know, but somehow Mr. Pete managed to track Mr. Watts and kill him nearby his own grave."
"All very well and said, Mr. Holmes. While this manservant of Mr. Sallow fits the description of the killer and fits the motivations as you laid them out, the case still lacks indisputable evidence."
Holmes quickly checks his pocket watch. It is more than the aboriginal manservant's size and strength of 6 foot 8 inches and over 300 pounds that condemns him. We have Mr. Watts himself to thank for placing Mr. Pete at the scene of the crime. For the footprints leaving Bunhill burial grounds showed the right imprint twice as deep as the left. Not from a man carrying off a heavy item, as Wiggins first surmised, but from the shifting of one's weight off an injured leg. The left leg, which received a maiming blow from a shovel at Mr. Watts's discretion, breaking the tool in two, yet not incapacitating his attacker. Keep in mind, gentlemen, there was no mention of a giant using a cane at the train station, nor at Mr. Watts's residence. No, I'm certain after medical examination you will find the damage to Mr. Pete's leg received on the eve of November 13th, damage consistent with a blow from a shovel. Holmes taps out the ash from his pipe into a white porcelain dish. There you have it, Inspector, and if my watch is correct of the time, you'll find Mr. Ebenezer Sallow and his servant, Peter Pete, seated at the window of this establishment for Ebenezer's afternoon spirit and business gossip of the hour. We all turn to see the men just as Holmes planned. The inspector jumps up.
"I'll have them in the yard within the hour. But that Ashmore, there's no evidence against him.
Holmes rises and dons his coat. Afraid not, Inspector. Not unless you get an unlikely confession from Mr. Sallow. It seems as though the Hellfire Club escapes the irons once again. A wily bunch working from the shadows, expertly manipulating others to do their dirty work. I'd double the eyes on that bunch if I were you. Outside the pub, we step out into the street and flag down a carriage. Behind us, a scuffle of men descends on Sallow and his manservant. The Australian doesn't take kindly to being arrested and puts down 3 constables before being finally subdued.